Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Hanukkah to those who are celebrating the holiday this week. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, sponsored by the Rose Project of Jewish Federation of Orange County and in partnership with Israel Policy Forum. I'm Lisa Armoni, and I'm the director of the Rose Project. The Rose Project is a resource for Israel education in Orange County. We are a nonpartisan organization and don't take policy positions, but rather seek to uplift discourse grounded in shared values on foundational matters that bind us as a people, even when we reach different political conclusions on those issues. We're therefore committed to exploring complex issues through a diversity of perspectives for the purpose of growing our collective knowledge. Before we get started with the program today, I'll go over a few housekeeping items so that you'll know how to participate in today's event. Thank you to the participants who submitted questions to our panelists in advance. You can continue to submit questions throughout the webinar by typing them into the Q&A box on your Zoom control panel, which is located at the bottom of your screen. After the formal presentation, which will be a Q&A, we'll address as many of your questions as time allows to our panelists. We are recording this webinar and we'll be happy to share the recording with you after the event. And you'll also find a link to it as well as to our other videos in our video library on our website, www.jewishoc.org. And I'll note that we're also live streaming right now on Facebook. And now for our webinar. Notwithstanding ongoing challenges to the election outcome, the Biden team is preparing for a transition of power in January. That, of course, raises a myriad of questions about what the future might hold for Israel and the region, for those who are committed to Israel and to a strong U.S.-Israel relationship. So we're thrilled today to have two outstanding analysts from the Israel Policy Forum to help us answer many of our questions. First, we're delighted to welcome back Dr. Michael Koplow, who spoke to us back in June. Michael is the policy director at the Israel Policy Forum, where, among many other things, he writes a weekly analysis called the Koplow column and edits the Israel Policy Exchange, which is a leading source for commentary and analysis on Israel and American Jewry. His work regularly appears in Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, and The Forward, among other publications. I'm also delighted to welcome Dr. Shira Efron, who's joining us today from Israel. Dr. Efron wears many hats. In addition to serving as a policy advisor for Israel Policy Forum, she's also a senior research fellow at the Tel Aviv-based Institute for National Security Studies, a special advisor on Israel with the RAND Corporation, and an adjunct scholar at the Modern War Institute at West Point. She specializes in policy analysis, research, and planning methods, and her research focuses on U.S. policy toward the Middle East. Her work is featured regularly in Israeli and international media outlets. So let's get started. I'm going to address my first question to Dr. Michael Koplow. And Michael, let's start off by mapping the environment that the Biden administration will be coming into. And I'd like to ask that you address both the regional environment in the Middle East, as well as the U.S. foreign policy environment, and perhaps even the congressional environment. What's changed over the last 4 years since Mr. Biden was vice president, and what has remained fairly consistent?
Sure, Lisa. So first of all, thanks for having me, and thanks as always to the Rose Project and to the Federation of Orange County. So there are a few important things, I think, that have changed over the past 4 years during the Trump administration and since Biden was last in the White House as vice president. The first is that there is a real sense, certainly in the Middle East, but I think internationally more generally, that the U.S. is not necessarily going to be as active in certain places as it traditionally was. And part of that has to do with the fact that the Trump administration has been generally skeptical of international engagements. We saw President Trump pull out of a number of deals or commitments that the U.S. had previously because he did not think that U.S. involvement going forward was in the U.S.'s best interests. The Iran deal, the JCPOA, was of course the most prominent example, but there were others as well. And there was also a skepticism from the Trump administration, which I think is also this is a skepticism that you see not just among Republicans but among some Democrats as well, of having the U.S. be entangled in different areas overseas that people also don't necessarily see as being in the U.S.'s best interests. And so, we saw a number of prominent examples of the Trump administration's reluctance to get bogged down in various places in the Middle East. Most prominently, President Trump's desire to withdraw American troops from Syria and from Iraq. And there's this ongoing debate about withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan. We saw it about a year ago, a little more than a year ago, when there was an Iranian cruise missile and drone attack on Saudi oil facilities. And I think many people were expecting some sort of U.S. response, but the U.S. determined that it was not necessarily in our direct interest to respond. And we've seen it in other places around the globe as well, but most prominently in the Middle East, where I think there was a real sense over the last 4 years that a combination of a different definition of American interests and also the fact that the Middle East is simply not as important for energy purposes for the U.S. anymore really led to this idea that we weren't necessarily going to be everywhere all the time. Now, under a Biden administration, we may see that shift a bit, but I think that whether it does or it doesn't, there is more of a skepticism around the world that the U.S. is going to be permanently all over the place, as as we certainly were for the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st. And so that presents one big change that I think is going to present challenges, not just to the next president, but to future presidents as well. This notion that the U.S. may not have an unparalleled role all over the place. Second, and this goes to the region itself more directly, when Biden left in January 2017, the Iran deal was still in place. And Iran's level of uranium enrichment was low. Since then, we saw the U.S. pull out of the JCPOA, and that meant two things. A, it meant that there were greater sanctions placed on Iran, and the benefits that Iran had gotten under the JCPOA were removed in terms of their access to cash and banking networks. Second, we saw Iran resume its uranium enrichment to levels that were designed to put pressure on the United States and on the other partners to the JCPOA. And so now, sitting here in December 2020, we have an Iranian regime that, by all accounts, is under more pressure in terms of a financial crunch, but has also enriched uranium at a much higher rate than it had been doing for the 3 years that the JCPOA was in existence. And so that is a big change, and I don't think we have a definitive answer yet on how the Biden administration will deal with that. But on both fronts, there's an argument to be made that perhaps the Iranian regime is because it's under greater pressure, that it may be closer to collapse. There's also an argument to be made that it's even more urgent now to deal with the nuclear issue, given the higher levels of uranium enrichment that have been taking place, in addition to even more recently in the past month, evidence that Iran is starting to rebuild some of its nuclear facilities underground in more hard positions. And then, lastly, there is a greater priority at the moment around the world on issues that really did not exist 4 years ago, and COVID is the most prominent one. And so I think there's a widespread expectation that the Biden administration is going to first and foremost focus on domestic issues rather than foreign policy. And that's not only the case in the United States, it's the case in many places. In Europe, in the Middle East, and Asia as well, there is this big effort to deal not only with COVID-19 directly, but to deal with the various economic fallout from COVID-19 and figure out how to proceed going forward. So those are all certainly things that have changed. What has not changed is still the basic geopolitical structure, where the same way that China and Russia presented, if not quite superpower, but global power challenges to the U.S. 4 years ago, those problems have not gone away. The Middle East, which is there was an ongoing joke during the Obama administration that we were always a day away from the pivot to Asia, and it never quite happened because the Middle East tended to interfere. And that is, I think that in a lot of ways that's still the case, and something that the next administration is going to have to deal with. And then to the last part of your question, with regard to Congress, Congress was a pretty polarized body 4 years ago. I think that it's even more so today. On both sides of the aisle, you have increasingly growing groups on the polls. People talk about in the Democratic Party. People talk about the Squad and how the Squad has added members in the last election. I think on the Republican side of the aisle, it's fair to say that the Freedom Caucus is larger and has more sway than it did even 4 years ago. And so I think within Congress, you're likely to see more pressure on both sides, I think, to really stick to respective partisan positions. And again, this is certainly not a new problem by any means. It was the case 4 years ago, and 8 years ago, and 12 years ago, and dating farther back. But I think that we're seeing an even greater hardening of kind of battle lines on both sides, and that's going to present difficulties for the next president, no matter which direction he wants to go.
Sure, absolutely. So I want to ask a question specifically about Israel and the Palestinians. So the Trump administration implemented a number of what were really unprecedented steps vis-a-vis Israel and the Palestinians, including moving the embassy and recognition of the Golan, and also the extent to which the PA was defunded and programs around bridge building were defunded. To what extent will the Biden administration's approach depart from the Trump approach? And also, do you think that certain steps that the Trump administration took will be walked back, or should we expect to see that most of what's already taken place will be left as it is?
I'll start with what is likely to remain, because it also kind of feeds into the previous question about changes in the region. Obviously, a big change in the region is the Abraham Accords and the normalization agreements that have been signed between Israel and a variety of other states, with Morocco being, I was going to say Morocco being the most recent. It's actually Bhutan is the most recent, coming on Saturday, but Morocco, which came toward the end of last week. And I think that is the element of the Trump administration that the Biden administration is almost certainly, I shouldn't say almost, is certainly going to keep and certainly going to try to build upon. There's no question that from an American perspective, it is good to have normalization agreements between Israel, which is a staunch ally of the United States, and other states in the region, most of which themselves are also partners of the United States. So that is something that has certainly changed, and from my perspective, for the better. And I think that the Biden administration is going to look to build upon that success, and A, try to make sure that these normalization agreements remain on track, and B, try to see if it can build upon them and add other countries to the mix. And some of the more high-profile moves, particularly the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and the relocation of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, are also going to stay under the Biden administration. I think, A, because they are moves that Joe Biden supports, But B, they are also moves that even if a president wanted to roll them back, and I don't think that the next President-elect Biden does, even if he did, it would require an enormous amount of political capital and exact great costs in terms of our relationship with Israel. So that stuff is going to stay. What is going to be shifted is the Trump policy, which, for all the focus on the ways in which President Trump enacted policies that were beneficial toward Israel, I think in a lot of ways, what is most notable about President Trump's policy on the Israeli-Palestinian front have been his moves toward the Palestinians. So, and those are the moves that are going to be reversed. As you noted, President Trump ended all U.S. aid to the West Bank and Gaza. It's important to note that actually the United States was not providing direct budget aid to the Palestinian Authority. That actually ended in 2014. But during the course of the Trump administration, Congress passed the Taylor-Force Act, which says that the U.S. cannot provide any aid in the West Bank and Gaza that directly benefits the Palestinian Authority, whether it's going directly to the PA or not. And President Trump also, aside from Taylor-Force, which is now binding U.S. law, President Trump also canceled the money that was spent by USAID in the West Bank and Gaza on humanitarian infrastructure projects, and also, as you noted, also canceled the aid that went to people-to-people programs that were largely spent on conflict mitigation and on fostering better governance within the PA. Now, the passage of Taylor-Force makes some of this tricky because, again, under US law, the US can't spend any money on anything that is going to directly benefit the Palestinian Authority. But I think the Biden administration is likely to look and see what categories of humanitarian aid and infrastructure in the West Bank and Gaza don't fall into this bucket, and they're likely to restore that. And I think they're also likely to restore some measure of funding to UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, which was also ended by the Trump administration. The other move that I think we're probably going to see reversed, although this is something that depends on Israeli government consent, the Trump administration closed the consulate general in Jerusalem, which had effectively acted as a separate diplomatic mission to the Palestinians. The consul general in Jerusalem did not report to the embassy, and the ambassador of the consul general reported directly back to the State Department. And about 2 years ago, the Trump administration closed that office and merged it into the embassy to create an Office of Palestinian Affairs under the embassy. That was a big deal for the Palestinians because what it signaled was that the US didn't necessarily value a separate relationship with the Palestinians that did not go through the Israelis. And it also signaled a backing away from two states because the message it sent was that anything that pertains to the Palestinians is going to go through the embassy to Israel. So reopening the consulate general, if it gets reopened in a different site, is going to require consent of the host government, which in this case is Israel, since the consulate general is in Jerusalem. But I think that's something that the new administration is going to look to do. And then lastly, the new administration, I think, is going to do what it can to shelve the Trump plan for a number of reasons. The first being that if it's designed to be a plan that can be the basis for negotiations, it's really not a workable approach because neither this Palestinian government nor really any conceivable Palestinian government would be able to negotiate on those terms. But also, despite the language in the Trump plan that portrayed it as a two-state arrangement, in a lot of ways it really was not. And I think that the Biden administration, in an effort to signal that it wants to back an eventual viable two-state outcome, is likely to shelve the Trump plan and to reiterate a commitment to a more traditional two-state outcome and then proceed from there.
Great. Thank you for that. I'm going to invite Dr. Shira Efron to join the conversation now. I want to turn to questions around Iran, and of course, Michael, feel free to share in the conversation as well. And Michael, you touched briefly about what happened within Iran in terms of uranium enrichment after the administration pulled out of the JCPOA. But Shira, I'd like to ask you if you could expound upon the impact of the Trump approach within Iran, both in terms of its nuclear capability and what it's been doing in terms of development, but also in terms of regional activity. Has the withdrawal from the JCPOA had the impact that both the Trump administration and Israel had hoped for?
Yeah, for having me. Can you all hear me all right? And it's great to be with you all here. I'll just mention that before moving back to Israel a year ago, I lived in California for 9 years and I miss it dearly. So good for you all that you're there. You know, it's really difficult to attribute Iranian behavior only to one thing that happened. So it's important that we mention, we clearly can trace back its enrichment of uranium to the agreement, because we know that as long as it complied with its commitment under the agreement. We need to remember at the beginning, it's only the US that withdrew from the agreement, but none other party actually withdrew. So Iran kept complying. When they stopped complying, we saw the enrichment, which, by the way, was really anticipated. We in 2018 anticipated this in a simulation, a war game, what would happen if the US actually withdraws from the agreement. So it wasn't a big surprise. With the withdrawal from the agreement, the Trump administration started a policy known as maximum pressure, which involved very heavy sanctions. Secretary of State Pompeo came up with something that's called Pompeo's 12 points, in which he didn't say that the US is calling for a regime change in Iran, but basically said that we will accept Iran if Iran complies with those 12 points, which essentially is calling for Iran to no longer be Iran. Everything about Iran in there. And I have no sympathy for the Iranian regime, so we can put this aside for a second, but this is just, so together, the withdrawal from the agreement, the 12-point strategy, and the maximum pressure has had an effect on Iranian behavior. There was no effect, no positive effect on Iranian behavior in the context of the nuclear agreement. And in Israel, at least in Israel, there was no delusion that it would affect it. There was a bit of effect in terms of Iran's regional behavior, because there was less money available to move to its proxies. Iran doesn't, have its own people on the ground. It uses proxies. So Lebanese Hezbollah, and there are Shia militias in Iraq and in Syria. And there's anecdotal evidence. Again, this is from intelligence officials that say there were stories in the Washington Post and New York Times. They're not sure. These are not anecdotes. That there was less money available. It did affect their ability to act. But what my understanding is that the metaphor being used here by the intelligence community, Israeli intelligence communities, of the onion. So yeah, it affected the external layers, the external appeal, but it didn't affect the core capability of Iran in the region. The reason I also said it's really hard to attribute it only to one policy or another is also that Iran's behavior in the region is really affected by the region itself. When Iran was at its maximum activity, malign activity, difficult activity from the US perspective and from the Israeli perspective, although from the US it's a little bit more nuanced, because Iran did help the United States fight ISIS in kind of like a weird turn of events. It was because this was the peak of the fighting. There's now less fighting that is actually occurring on the ground in Syria, so there's less need for Iran to flex its muscles. So one person can say, oh, it's maximum pressure, and that's constraining their activities. And another person can say, well, you know what, they actually don't need to do it. There's no question that there is an impact, but it's not the impact that I think advocates of this strategy say that it has. And by the way, we have to be very clear on that, because a lot of the people, the biggest proponents of not returning to the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement, and proponents of continuing with the maximum pressure strategy, they say, well, we know it's not working perfectly yet, not working maybe now, but just like keep at it, eventually it will work. So I think there's no like real daylight in terms of the assessment of how things work at the moment. It's more like, what is the most effective strategy going forward? And then, you know, we can talk about it, but I think from the Israeli perspective, Iran's behavior in the region is very, very, very problematic. But it's not the sort of existential threat the prime minister speaks about, and this is the nuclear domain. And how do you deal with both things? And can you really deal with them together? And for many years, U.S. and many Israelis thought you can't. But now the conversation is changing a bit, and I think it's unrealistic to think that you can deal with all these things at once in a comprehensive way. Just because Iran will seek so many concessions on the nuclear file to curb its behavior in the region, that it's not going to be worth it. And also, we need to speak about the regime, what the Iranian regime wants. The Iranian regime wants to survive. From their perspective, their regional activity, their missiles, and being a threshold nuclear state, not necessarily actually having nuclear weapons, but being a threshold nuclear state serves this purpose very well. So we have to be realistic with the Iran that we're dealing with. And sadly, I don't think this regime is going anywhere soon, despite the hopes of many and let's say more proactive efforts of this the outgoing administration.
Could you comment that there's the assassination recently of the Iranian nuclear scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was the second major assassination that has taken place, and we know that there has been some other instances of infiltration into Iran, into some of the most sensitive areas. How has that impacted the regime, both in terms of internal politics and in terms of a regional dimension?
So really, I'm not. I'm more of I'm not an internal Iran policy, so I'm not sure about the domestic things there. I think Iran is feeling, though, very vulnerable, because it clearly shows great intelligence capabilities within Iran. It's not just those assassinations. It's also, I'll remind everyone, when Israel got a hold of the nuclear archive. That is a very sophisticated operation, which means that Israel has assets on the ground, and Iran feels very vulnerable. And we see this vulnerability also in how they punish anyone that they suspect is a collaborator with the Zionist regime. And we saw this appalling assassination execution of the journalist just a couple of days ago. Mm-hmm. So it makes Iran feel vulnerable. This is in addition, by the way, and I think I didn't mention this before, but there is a sense in Iran now is that the United States may not be reliable, that if between one administration and another, they're going to change the policy, what can we do? In response to Jake Sullivan, the incoming national security advisor, he was implying in one of his remarks on Iran, he said, well, you know what, we have to remove the sanctions because this is the only way for Iran to come back to the negotiation table with us. And I think he's correct. But then we can just like put the sanctions again and create leverage. Iran, and there was a speech today of Khamenei in the parliament, which I read a translation of, and it seems that they're saying, well, we know that what the United States is going to do, they're going to place sanctions and then uplift the sanctions, and we can't rely on them. So instead of trying to work with the sanctions that the US imposes, we should find alternative sources. We should go to China. We should go to Russia. We should try to not be dependent on the West. We should find other ways to. So these are the impacts. They're saying an unreliable not unreliable, unpredictable, let's say. US policy that keeps changing from one administration to another, plus great intelligence capabilities of Israel, plus, and Michael mentioned it, there's a regional environment that's a bit changing. Iran is very unhappy about these normalization deals between Israel and Arab states. Everyone knew the back channels existed before, but bringing them to the forefront of them. So these things do have an impact. They make Iran more insecure, and I'm not convinced that an insecure Iran is Iran that is safer for its neighbors.
Great. So I thank you for that. I want to continue in this direction around questions around Iran and the JCPOA, and I'll invite you both to answer as you see fit. So you mentioned, Shira, these new normalization between Arab Gulf states and Israel. So I'd like to explore that a little bit and think about how these changing relationships, the closer relations, very, very, now public relationships between Israel and the Gulf states might shape the way the Biden administration thinks about the JCPOA, specifically if it's seeking to re-enter it. How might that change some of the dynamic in a way that wasn't existent or may not have been existent 4 years ago, 5 years ago, when Biden was last in Washington?
I'll take a short stab at it, then I'd be curious what Michael thinks. It's something we actually haven't spoken about. So, but we need to remember that some of the one of the reasons we are seeing these normalization deals now is actually the seeds were planted with the Obama administration and around the negotiations with Iran, right? It brought Israel and Arab countries that share the concerns on Iran together. And they're also coming together with the idea that the US at one point or another is going to withdraw from the region. They're not doing it yet. This pivot is not coming, but the one thing that actually keeps them in the region is Iran, right? So how do we deal with Iran, which is very different between the administrations now, right? Both of them think Iran is trouble, but how do we deal with it? I'm not sure it changes the Biden administration's strategy, because they do want to go back to negotiations. There's clearly a front here that is a little bit more visible against going back to the JCPOA, but this front existed also in 2015. We also don't see the same active opposition or vocal opposition from the Arab countries. We don't see it from Saudi. We don't see it from the UAE. If you think about it, Israel's lying on the fence for all the others, right? Netanyahu is the one going and speaking to Michael Duran and basically warning the Biden administration on going on behalf of all countries in the region. Maybe he would do it otherwise, but we don't see the same vocal opposition from the other countries, although they are probably planning to sound it in quiet channels. We also need to remember, and I think there's a nuance on this, people in Israel tend to inflate not inflate, but maybe hype up the convergence of interest, Israeli interests with other Arab countries on Iran. And they're not aligned 100%. Geography here does play a difference. They're much closer to Iran. They're Iran's neighbor. They can suffer from Iran. They're much more vulnerable to Iran's activities, direct activities, right? And if you remember the attack on Saudi Aramco and the Arabs, which was super sophisticated, and Saudi Arabia did nothing in response. Not to mention Yemen and the Houthis, where they're losing the fight, despite all these weapons that the U.S. sells them, right? So, and by the way, you saw the UAE, Israel's new best friend. The UAE and Bahrain, and Bahrain does everything that Saudi says. They in response to the assassination of the Zionist Moshe Efron, they condemned it. So this is also something we have to remember. That's not really a united front, and I don't think this is a very new development, but it's a more visible one. I don't know if Michael.
Yeah, So first of all, rare to find a topic that Shira and I have not discussed. So it's a good question. I'll build upon a few of the things that Shira said. So for starters, it obviously, as Shira points out, before the JCPOA was negotiated in 2015, there was opposition from Israel and there was opposition from Gulf states. And Israel, as Shira pointed out, was the public face of this. And in fact, until the WikiLeaks dumps, I don't think people even realized quite the extent to which the Gulf states were opposed. You had messages leaked from King Abdullah, at the time King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, where he talked about the need to cut off the head of the snake. And so, it seems in hindsight that the Gulf states at the time perhaps would have even supported military action, which they didn't publicly. I think this time, given the Abraham Accords and given the public relationship between Israel and these other states, it's going to be a bit harder for there to be a public message and a private message from all of them that isn't in sync. And I think that the Israelis in particular may seek to get public Gulf state buy-in for what they're doing. And we actually saw an example of this last week when Ron Dermer, who is the Israeli ambassador to the U.S., and Yusuf Al-Otaiba, who is the Emirati ambassador to the U.S., gave a joint interview. I think it was to MSNBC. They gave a joint interview, and they spoke about the threat from Iran. And so I think that there may end up being a bit more of a united public front that there wasn't last time. To Shira's point though about the difference between where Israel sits and where these other states sit in relation to Iran, it's both about geography and it's about capabilities. Of course, these states that are sitting right on Iran's border are more susceptible to retaliation from Iran. But they also don't necessarily themselves have the same capabilities that the Israelis do to pursue a military solution. So, it may be that Israel has a higher tolerance, along with capacity, to challenge Iran militarily if it's not satisfied with how things go than these other states do, and that may cause some friction. That may cause some friction between them. So, the one thing that I think we'll see certainly immediately is that Israel and the Gulf states, whether they have signed normalization agreements with Israel or not, they all have the same complaint about the JCPOA, which was that it did not address Iranian regional activities. And, that's the part that is more concerning in some ways to them, because, I don't think the Emiratis fear that there'll ever be an Iranian nuclear strike on Dubai if Iran were to have military nuclear capabilities. But they do have to deal with Iranian ballistic missiles and nefarious Iranian adventurism throughout the region. And so they certainly are going to present a united front that puts pressure on the Biden administration to negotiate either a follow-on or a reformulated JCPOA from the start that deals with these other issues. And I think that that's going to present a challenge for the Biden administration should they choose to re-enter the JCPOA as is. They really are going to be dealing with regional allies who are going to be speaking with one voice, not just privately but publicly.
Okay, thank you for that very helpful explanation. We're going to turn to some of the questions that our participants are sending in. And so there's some questions around, again, back to the subject of Israel and the Palestinians. So we have participants asking if you think the Israeli agreements with the Gulf Arab states will have an impact on the Israeli-Palestinian. Could it lead to a renewed peace process, or will it have any kind of effect on the relations between the two?
So maybe I'll take the first stab at it this time. And I'll note that Shira and I are in the early stages of a project, along with our colleague Evan Gottesman, to write a report looking at this idea precisely. At the moment, it's hard to say because it requires answers to a number of questions that we don't necessarily have hard answers to at the moment. One is the extent to which the Arab states genuinely want to be involved in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Because if they don't want to get bogged down in an area of policy that has, traditionally been a difficult one, at the moment it seems that they can have relationships with Israel without having to involve themselves in a big way in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so, I think one question that requires answering is whether they're actually going to want to get involved, or whether they feel as if they have to. I think the conventional wisdom is that one of the main reasons that Saudi Arabia hasn't signed the normalization agreement yet is because the internal politics of Saudi Arabia are such that it will require some sort of real concession from Israel on the Palestinian front. Whereas for these other states so far, it doesn't necessarily require that. A second question, which is in some ways related, is to what extent the Palestinians are actually going to be responsive to intervention from Arab states, so that even if Arab states wanted to be involved, do they actually have the influence or the wherewithal within Palestinian Authority, or I should say PLO circles, to influence the direction in which the Palestinians go? Because the whole theory of outside in, where Israel first signs agreements with outside Arab states, and then that leads to an Israeli-Palestinian agreement, isn't only that it puts pressure on the Palestinians to compromise, it's also that you then have this coalition of Arab states that has relationships with Israel, and so they themselves as well are in a position to both move the Israelis and pressure the Palestinians while also providing them with support behind the scenes. Within the PA right now, Mahmoud Abbas, has been there for decades. It doesn't appear as if he is ever going to leave that position, absent death from natural causes. And so, he's kind of stuck in this spot where, he's generally seen as being inflexible and not very susceptible either to outside pressure or outside advice. And so, I think there are a lot of factors here that that make it a difficult question to answer. But I'll turn to Shira to weigh in on whatever I haven't.
Yes, so I think it's a very difficult question. And of course, the Palestinian initial response, which was very counterproductive on their part, was to reject these agreements. They responded in ways that were almost violent and childish. And it's not just the advice, they're working now on repairing their ties with Arab countries, which is the one thing. Michael spoke about the countries with which Israel normalized ties now, and the Palestinians, and we spoke at length about the Biden administration. A lot of it would depend on what happens in Israel. In the Israeli mindset, first of all, it's been a long-term trend, but especially since January, February of 2019, with the coronavirus epidemic. I mean, no one has paid attention to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, even when annexation was on the table, and it was something that, someone has been following. We really did not know a few weeks in if this was going to happen or not. We didn't even know if the prime minister really means to do it or not. There were surveys that showed that only 4% of Israelis thought that this was a meaningful event. So this is not even something that's on the Israeli mindset. With this new normalization agreement, they kind of reinforce this indifference to the Palestinian issue in Israeli eyes, because we get all these peace deals. Who is even talking to us about the Palestinians? It's a non-issue. Sadly, and I say this as someone who lives in Israel, it becomes an issue only when there's violence, And unfortunately, we've known this for a long, long time, that there hasn't been an Israeli-Arab conflict. There is an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Israeli-Arab conflict is not an issue. And I think that the Israeli, I hope not, right? But at one point, it might become clear that despite these great normalization deals, which I'm very supportive of, and I find them very important and we don't usually get good news from the Middle East, so this is really good news. But despite those agreements, Israel has not solved the primary conflict with which it's dealing. And those are the Palestinians. And there are 2 million Palestinians in Gaza and 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank, and they're not going anywhere, despite what some people here would like to think. So this could also, depending on developments and change in leadership on both on the Palestinian side, and who knows, there are elections in Israel again. This can also lead to a development on that front. But I think Michael and I will have better answers in just a couple of months.
So then we'll definitely be looking forward to your report and sharing it out with the community. So people have been asking. I mean, from the way that you're speaking about it, it sounds like really not much attention is being paid at all to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. People, everybody is very occupied with COVID, and these agreements are happening, as you said, without really dealing with the conflict. But a number of participants are asking whether you believe that a path to a two-state solution is still open. Is this something that eventually, perhaps when after some of the more pressing domestic issues in the United States are dealt with, particularly COVID, is this might be a point of re-entry for the Biden administration? And is there any sort of interest at all in alternative solutions? There are a number of solutions out there that people are talking about, Confederate arrangements and things like that. I mean, is there any sort of traction or interest at all? Or do you suspect that we may be more in a period of conflict management rather than resolution?
You know, I can just like respond quickly, and Michael can take it further. We, together with Evan Gottesman, I wrote a report for Israel Policy Forum on looking at assessing the alternative models for solutions for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I actually don't want to call them solutions because some of them are not solutions, they're just like outcomes that are inevitable. A binational state that just, or perpetuation of the status quo. I would also say that the RAND Corporation, we just released another report examining the public attitudes on both sides, the Israelis and Palestinians. We conducted surveys in focus groups with Israelis and Palestinians of all sects of society to examine this exact question. I don't think that the conditions are very promising for a solution. But I think that if there is a solution, the only one can be of separation to two states, at least now. Despite what liberal circles, and many of them are my friends, and in the U.S., and I think there's this idea that, oh, if a two-state solution we can, because there are too many settlements, and it's really hard to separate the land. So it must be a one-state solution, or it must be a more collaborative model, like a confederation. And this just is a very, I think, wrong interpretation of developments on the ground. The fact is that there are two populations here that indeed they are in the same physical space. For the most part, they're separate. There's a small area where, relatively small area where they share the space. But they're not in the mode of cooperation, collaboration, coexistence. They're becoming more nationalistic. You would say in some parts more religious. There's fear and hatred, and those are not good things. But putting them together in one model where they have to share and collaborate is not going to bode well for both societies. So at the moment, I think the trends are going in a very, very different way than what we're seeing as one of these alternatives. It is clear that because of the way the land is, the two-state solution that we're speaking about, and maybe Michael has different interpretation, it's not going to be, can't be a two states of like, oh, there's the iron wall, you're there, we're here, we never talking to each other, because environmental sources are going to be shared, and water, and their public health and issues as we're seeing them today. So there's going to be a lot of sharing and security sharing, and the fact that this the Palestinian state, according to all agreements that the Palestinians have agreed to this, will be demilitarized, right? So there's going to be a lot of partnership, and there is a lot of partnership today, but in the format of separation and not sort of unification. I don't know. I'm sure Michael agrees.
Yes, I do agree with everything Shira said, and I'll just add on the question of the Biden administration and whether there is room once COVID has passed us to get the two sides back together. On Wednesday, we're releasing a report that I wrote under the auspices of the Center for New American Security, along with Ilan Goldenberg and Tammy Wittes. That is it's a report looking at what a new U.S. policy toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should look like. And it's a long report. There are lots of recommendations, but if I had to boil it down to one sentence, our sort of basic theme is that the U.S. should not be looking to sponsor negotiations between the two sides. That the environment is entirely unripe for a conflict-ending agreement, and that the traditional U.S. stance of negotiations, we shouldn't let that get in the way of right now advancing freedom, prosperity, and security for both sides, while making sure that the environment remains okay for two states down the road. And I think that there is, almost universal consensus, certainly on the Democratic side, within foreign policy circles, that Israeli-Palestinian negotiations at this point would have 100% chance of failure, not because two states is no longer viable, but because on both sides, the leaderships really aren't terribly interested in making the compromises or decisions that would be necessary to get to a viable two-state outcome. And so I don't think that the Biden administration is going to look to oversee negotiations. I think that it's much more likely to set out a series of policies and ideas that it wants each side to pursue that will improve the situation on the ground, mostly in terms of quality of life for Palestinians and in terms of security for Israelis, and not do anything that will put a two-state outcome out of reach. But we're not going to be in an era of high-profile negotiations or talks or White House South Lawn handshakes.
Okay, thank you. And for those of you who are interested in seeing the reports that have been released already, I see that they have been, there's a link to them that's in the chat. And so please feel free to access them. And I'm certain that the upcoming reports will be on the Israel Policy Forum website. And so we all look forward to looking at them as well. So we are near the top of the hour, and I want to say thank you so much to our guests, Michael Koplow and to Shira Efron. Thank you for your insights and your analysis. And we look forward to continuing the conversation. As we chatted earlier, there's never a dull time in the Middle East. There's always going to be things for us to discuss with our community. And so we look forward to having you back as we continue to learn together. So I want to say thank you and wish you again happy Hanukkah, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you. Chag Sameach, happy Hanukkah.